This is Jocko Podcast number 103 with Echo Charles and me, Jocko Willink. Good evening, Echo.
Good evening.
Whilst lying at Winchester, young as I was in the profession, I was picked out amongst others to perform a piece of duty that, for many years afterwards, remained deeply impressed upon my mind and gave me the first impression of the stern duties of a soldier's life. A private of the 70th Regiment had deserted from that corps and afterwards enlisted into several other regiments. Indeed, I was told at the time that 16 different times he had received the bounty and then stolen off. Being, however, caught at last, he was brought to trial at Portsmouth and sentenced by general court-martial to be shot. As the execution would be a good hint to us young'uns, there were 4 lads picked out of our corps to assist in this piece of duty, myself being one of the number chosen. Besides these men, 4 soldiers from 3 other regiments were ordered on the firing party, making 16 at all. The place of execution was Portsdown Hill, and the different regiments assembled must have composed a force of about 15,000 men, having been assembled from the Isle of Wight, from Chichester, Gosport, and other places. The sight was very imposing, and appeared to make a deep impression on all there. As for myself, I felt that I would have given a good round sum, had I possessed it, to have been in any other situation rather than the one which I now found myself. And when I looked into the faces of my companions, I saw, by the pallor and anxiety depicted in each countenance, the reflection of my own feelings. When all was ready, we were moved to the front, and the culprit was brought out. He made a short speech to the parade, acknowledging the justice of his sentence and that drinking and evil company had brought the punishment upon him. He behaved himself firmly and well and did not seem to flinch at all. After being blindfolded, he was desired to kneel down behind a coffin which was placed on the ground, and the drum major of the depot giving us an expressive glance, we immediately commenced to loading. This was done in the deepest silence, and the next moment we were primed and ready. There was then a dreadful pause for a few moments, and the drum major, again looking towards us, gave us the signal agreed upon before, a flourish of his cane, and we leveled and fired. We had been previously strictly enjoined to be steady and take good aim, and the poor fellow, pierced by several balls, fell heavily upon his back. As he lay with his arms pinioned to his sides, I observed that his hands waved for a few moments, like the fins on a fish when in the agonies of death. The drum major also observed the movement, and, making another signal, 4 of our party immediately stepped up to the prostrate body and, placing the muzzles of their pieces to the head, fired and put him out of his misery. The different regiments then fell back by companies, and the word being given to march past in slow time. When each company came in line with the body, the word was given to mark time, and then eyes left in order that we all might observe the terrible example. We then moved onwards and marched from the ground to our different quarters. And that is from a book called Recollections of Rifleman Harris, who was an enlisted soldier for the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars, and that was his welcome to the army. He'd been in for about 3 weeks of service when he had to stand and execute a fellow soldier for basically being drunk and disorderly, not doing what he was supposed to do. Essentially, he was being executed for being a human being. And that was the introduction to military service for Rifleman Harris. Rifleman Harris's full name was Benjamin Randall Harris. He enlisted in 1803. He fought all over Europe in the Peninsular War, which posed Bourbon Spain, the Kingdom of Portugal, and the British Empire against Napoleon's French Empire and Bonapartist Spain, and also the Duchy of Warsaw. And this is a war where they have daggers and swords and bayonets and mounted cavalry charges. They have cannons, and they used a lot of muzzle loading rifles, which a skilled rifleman could load and fire about 3 times per minute. Accurate, out to about 200 yards. Very different from the weapons that we have now, which can fire 3 rounds in a second. And are very accurate, out to 800 yards, 1,000 yards, and some sniper weapons way further than that. But even though these weapons are different from the weapons we see in modern warfare, as always, in the end, it is men. It is human beings on the battlefield, bleeding, sweating, starving, suffering, killing, and being killed. Let's find out a little bit more about Rifleman Harris. Going back to the book. My father was a shepherd, and I was a sheep boy from my earliest youth. Indeed, as soon as almost I could run, I began helping my father to look after the sheep on the downs of Blandford in Dorsetshire, where I was born. Whilst I continued to tend the flocks and herds under my charge, and occasionally in the long winter nights, I learned the art of making shoes. I grew a hardy little chap, and was one fine day in the year of 1802 drawn as a soldier for the Army of Reserve. Thus, without troubling myself much about the change which was about to take place in the quiet of my routine days, I was drafted into the 66th Regiment of Foot, bid goodbye to my shepherd companions, and was obliged to leave my father without an assistant to collect his flocks, just as he was beginning more than ever to require one. Nay, indeed, I may say to want tending and looking after himself, for old age and infirmary were coming on him. His hair was growing white as the sleet of our downs, and his countenance becoming as furrowed as the plowed fields around. However, as I had no choice in the matter, it was quite as well that I did not grieve over my fate. My father tried hard to buy me off, and would have persuaded the sergeant of the 66th that I was of no use as a soldier, from having maimed my right hand by breaking the forefinger when I was a child. The sergeant, however, said I was just the sort of little chap he wanted, and off he went, carrying me amongst a batch of recruits he had collected away with him. Sheep herder.
Mm-hmm.
Dad's getting old. Army comes and gets you. That's the way it works. England, 1802. Now, he travels around a little bit and eventually ends up in Dublin. And here we go back to the book. Whilst in Dublin, I one day saw a corps of the 95th Rifles and fell so in love with their smart, dashing, and devil-may-care appearance that nothing would serve me until I was a rifleman myself. So on arriving at Cashel one day and falling in with the recruiting party of that regiment, I volunteered into the 2nd Battalion. This recruiting party were all Irishmen, and had been sent over from England to collect, amongst others, men from the Irish militia, and were just about to return to England. I think they were as reckless and devil-may-care a set of men I had ever beheld, either before or since. So these riflemen, I would say, from what I read about them, they're almost like a special ops unit. Mm-hmm. And one big difference is they're wearing, instead of wearing red jackets like the Brits would wear at this time, they wore green. So they were a little bit different. And they had more accurate rifles, and they would fight. They would do what they called skirmishing, which is fundamentally cover and move. They'd shoot and they'd maneuver, and they'd act like little special operations troops out there. And of course, it's interesting to me, and when I hear this guy talking about the first time he saw someone that looked a little bit like a special operations troop, he said, he actually says, I fell in love with it. Yeah. You know, that's very much how I felt as I was growing up. The more I saw, you know, the special ops, and it actually didn't even need to be special ops. For me, it was just someone in the military. But then he was already in the military, so now he's looking for the next thing. What's the next thing going to be? And here he ends up as a rifleman. So he's now a rifleman. He moves over to their regiment, and here we go back to the book. The next day we marched for Ashford in Kent, where I joined the 95th Rifles, and about 6 months after my joining, 4 companies of the 2nd Battalion were ordered on the expedition to Denmark. We embarked at Deal, and sailing for hostile shores, landed on a little place called, I think, Scarlet Island. The expedition consisted of about 30,000 men. And at the moment of our getting on shore, the whole force set up one simultaneous and tremendous cheer, a sound I cannot describe. It seemed so inspiring. This indeed was the first time of my hearing the style in which our men give tongue when they get near the enemy, though afterwards my ears became pretty well accustomed to such sounds. As soon as we got on shore, the rifles were pushed forward. And when he says the rifles, he's talking about his guys. The rifles were pushed forward as the advance, in chain order, through some thick woods of fir. And when we had cleared these woods and approached Copenhagen, sentries were posted on the roads and openings leading toward the town in order to intercept all comers and prevent all supplies. Such posts were occupied for about 3 days and nights, whilst the town was being fired upon by our shipping. I rather think this was the first time of the Congreve rockets being brought into play, and they rushed through the air in the dark. They appeared so like so many fiery serpents, creating, I should think, terrible dismay among the besieged. The Congreve rockets, they basically look like giant bottle rockets in a way, and they got, at this time, they were getting their range out to 1,500, 2,000 meters, so it was a pretty crazy weapon. And I can tell you, rockets in this day and age have become fairly accurate, but in those days, probably about as accurate as a bottle rocket is my guess. Back to the book. As the main army came up, we advanced and got as near under the walls of the place as we could without being endangered by the fire from our own shipping. So what's happening right there is cover and move. The shipping is bombarding, and these guys are advancing as close as they can, where they're not going to get killed by their own fire from the ships. We now received orders ourselves to commence firing, and the rattling of the guns I shall not easily forget. I felt so much exhilarated that I could hardly keep back, and was checked by the commander of the company, who called me by my name to keep my place. About this time, my front rank man, a tall fellow named Jack Johnson, showed a disposition as though the firing had an effect on him the reverse of what it had had on many others of the company, for he seemed inclined to hang back, and once or twice turned round in my face. I was a rear rank man and porting my piece. In the excitement of the moment, I swore that if he did not keep his ground, I would shoot him dead on the spot. So that he found it would be quite as dangerous for him to return as to go on. I feel sorry to record the want of courage of this man, but I do so with the less pain it gives me the opportunity of saying that during my many years of arduous service, it is the only instance I remember of a British soldier endeavoring to hold back when his comrades were moving forward. Indeed, Johnson was never held again in estimation among the Rifle Corps. For the story got wind that I had threatened to shoot him for cowardice in the field, and Lieutenant Cox mentioned to the colonel that he had overheard my doing so, and such was the contempt the man was held in by the Rifles that he was soon afterwards removed. There you go. First time under fire. It's interesting how Rifleman Harris, first time under fire, he wants to get after it. He is ready to charge. And only one guy out of their whole crew is looking like he's going to hold back. And they talk about reputation here. And that's definitely something that is, when you get to the SEAL teams, as you're a new guy, someone tells you, they'll say, hey, your reputation is everything. And it's totally true. And it's the same in any military organization. What your reputation is, because in the military, you think rank's all important, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is there's something that completely trumps rank, and that's reputation.
Yeah.
And if you're, I mean, I always talk about the fact that relationships are more important than chain of command, but you're not going to have a good relationship with people if you don't have a good reputation. It's not happening.
Yeah.
So
makes sense.
Same thing back in 1803.
Yeah.
Back to the book. Whilst in Denmark, we led a tolerably active life, the Rifles being continually on the alert, ordered hither today and countermanded the next. Occasionally, also, we had some pleasant adventures among the blue-eyed Danish lasses, for the Rifles were always terrible fellows in that way. I think that doesn't need too much explanation. I'll say this as I always say, I have to fast forward through this book. I'm not reading the entire book, even though the entire book is awesome. In this point here, they're embarking for Portugal. We have another campaign to go on. Back to the book. I wish I could picture the splendid sight of the shipping in the Downs at the time we embarked with about 20,000 men. Those were times which the soldiers of our own more peaceable days have little conception of. So this book was written before World War I, and really this was the last big war, is the wars that he went through, the Napoleonic Wars. So he's kind of saying, you don't even know what this is like anymore. Yeah. You don't know what it's like.
Yeah.
You don't know the soldiers of our own more peaceable days have little conception of what it's like to embark 20,000 troops to get ready and go get some. Back to the book. We sailed majestically out of the Cove of Cork for hostile shore, where we safely arrived and disembarked at Mondego Bay. The Rifles were first out of the vessels, for we were indeed always in front of the advance and always in the rear in retreat. Like the Kentish men of old, we claimed the post of honor in the field. I tried to figure out what that Kentish men, Kent is obviously a place, and the best I could figure out was that the people in Kent stood up hardcore against the Norman invasion. And I think that's what that references to. I'm sure somebody will correct me, and I hope somebody does. Yeah. Back to the book. Being immediately pushed forward up the country in advance of the main body, many of us in this hot climate very soon began to find out the misery of the frightful load we were condemned to march and fight under, with a burning sun above our heads and our feet sinking every step into the hot sand. The weight I myself toiled under was tremendous, and I often wonder at the strength I possessed at this period which enabled me to endure it. For indeed, I am convinced that many of our infantry sank and died under the weight of their knapsacks alone. For my own part, being a handicraft, I marched under the weight sufficient to impede the free motions of a donkey. For besides my well-filled kit, There was the greatcoat rolled on its top, my blanket and camp kettle, my haversack stuffed full of leather for repairing the men's shoes, together with a hammer and other tools, ship biscuit and beef for 3 days. I also carried my canteen filled with water, my hatchet and rifle, and 80 rounds of ball cartridge in my pouch. This last, except the beef and biscuit, being the best thing I owned, and which I always gave the enemy the benefit of when the opportunity offered. It's interesting. He knew how to work on shoes, and so he carries stuff to repair shoes in the field. Hey, think about that. That's just a lost art, isn't it? But think about where you are in the field when you have to march 15 miles a day and you have no shoes. If there's someone that can fix your shoes, that's a godsend. Back to the book. The next day we again advanced, and being in a state of the utmost anxiety to come up along the French, neither the heat of the burning sun, long miles, or heavy knapsacks were able to diminish our ardor. Indeed, I often look back with wonder at the light-hearted style, the jollity, and the reckless indifference with which men who were so destined in short time to fall hurried onwards toward the field of strife, seemingly without a thought of anything but the sheer love of meeting the foe and the excitement of battle. He wrote this book 20-something years after this happened. After this experience. I want to say he wrote it in 1930 something, 1938 maybe is when it came out. And you can see that. So my point in saying that is that looking back, he knows, because he's going to go through hell. He's going to go through hardcore combat. But even knowing how horrible combat is, he still looks back and is amazed at how they were ready to go. Going back to the book, the 29th Regiment received so terrible a fire that I saw the right wing almost annihilated, and the colonel, I think his name was Lennox, lay sprawling amongst the rest. We had caught ourselves in it pretty handsomely, for there was no cover for us, and we were rather too near. The living skirmishers were laying beside heaps of their own dead, but still we had our own till the battalion regiments come up. Fire and retire is a very good sound, but the rifles were not over fond of such notes. We never performed that maneuver except when it was made pretty plain to us that it was quite necessary. The 29th, however, had got their fairing here at this time, and the shock of that fire seemed to stagger the whole line and make them recoil. At the moment, a little confusion appeared in the ranks, I thought. Lord Hill was near at hand and saw it, and I observed him come galloping up. He put himself at the head of the regiment and restored them to order in a moment. There's some leadership, just full-on leadership in action. So there's also fire and retire. What that means is cover and move. So you have some people shooting and some people falling back. That's how they retreat. And they use that whenever they have to retreat. You'll hear that. And I don't know if I made this clear enough, but it's a bugle. It's a bugle signal. So the bugle would play some certain number of notes or some pattern of notes, and everyone would know, okay, that means fire and retire. So now we get that broad plan out to everyone at once, which is, instead of advancing, which is what we were doing, now we're gonna retreat. Right. And as soon as you get everyone that information, now little elements can start to make it happen. That's decentralized command. But you have to have good communications in order for that to work. And what you need to communicate is the broad plan. And that's what they get done with a nice little bugle signal. Back to the book. Pouring a regular and sharp fire upon the enemy, he galled them in return. And remaining with the 29th until he brought them to the charge, quickly sent the foe in the right about. It seemed to me that few men could have conducted the business with more coolness and quietude of manner under such a storm of balls as he was exposed to. Indeed, I have never forgotten him from that day. So yeah, it's important to also recognize that you have a group of men that are about to fall apart. And there's confusion. And one guy, and I talk about this all the time, one guy steps up takes ownership of the situation, leads, and it changes the entire outcome of the battle. Think about that one person.
Yeah.
You got 1,000 men versus 1,000 men. One person makes the difference.
Yeah.
So if you're in a leadership position, think about that. Think about what you're doing. Are you leading? Are you stepping up? Are you galloping up on a horse and setting things right? Because that's what you need to be doing. Back to the book. At the time I was remarking these matters, loading and firing as I lay, another circumstance divided my attention for a while and made me forget even the gallant conduct of General Hill. A man near me uttered a scream of agony, and looking from the 29th, who were on my right, to the left, whence the screech had come, I saw one of our sergeants named Frazier sitting in a doubled-up position and swaying backwards and forwards as though he had got a terrible pain in his bowels. He continued to make such complaint that I arose and went to him, for he was rather a crony of mine. "Oh, Harris," said he, as I took him in my arms, "I shall die, I shall die. The agony is so great that I cannot bear it." It was indeed dreadful to look upon him. The froth came from his mouth, and the perspiration poured from his face. Thank heaven, he was soon out of pain, and laying him down, I returned to my place. Poor fellow, he suffered more for a short time that he was dying than any man I think I ever saw in the same circumstances. I had the courtesy to return and look at him after the battle. A musket ball, I found, had taken him sideways and gone through both groins. Within about a half an hour after this, I left Sergeant Frazier, and indeed, for the time, had as completely forgotten him as if he had died 100 years back. The sight of so much bloodshed around will not suffer the mind to dwell long in any particular casualty, even though it happened to one's dearest friends. There was no time either to think, for all was action with us rifles just at this moment, and the barrel of my piece was so hot from continual firing that I could hardly bear to touch it, and was obliged to grasp the stock beneath the iron as I continued to blaze away. Doesn't even have time to think about it.
Yeah.
James Ponton was another crony of mine, a gallant fellow. He had pushed himself in front of me and was checked by one of our officers for his rashness. "Keep back, you, Ponton," the lieutenant said to him more than once, but Ponton was not to be restrained by anything but a bullet when in action. This time he got one, which, striking him in the thigh, I suppose hit an artery, for he died quickly. The Frenchman's balls were flying very wickedly at that moment, and I crept up to Ponton and took shelter by lying behind and making a rest for my rifle of his dead body. It strikes me that I revenged his death by the assistance of his carcass. At any rate, I tried my best to hit his enemies hard. There were 2 small buildings to our front, and the French, having managed to get into them, annoyed us much from that quarter. A small rise in the ground closed before these houses also favored them, and our men were being handled very severely in consequence. They became angry and wouldn't stand it any longer. One of the skirmishers, jumping up, rushed forward, crying, "Over, boys, over, over!" When instantly, the whole line responded to the cry, "Over, over, over!" They ran along the grass like wildfire and dashed at the rise, fixing their sword bayonets as they ran. The French light bobs could not stand the sight, but turned about and fled. And getting possession of their ground, we were soon inside the buildings. After the battle was over, I stepped across the other house I have mentioned in order to see what was going on there. For the one I remained in was now pretty well filled with the wounded, both French and English, who had managed to get there for a little shelter. 2 or 3 surgeons also had arrived at this house and were busily engaged in giving their assistance to the wounded, now also here lying as thickly as in the building which I had left. But what struck me the most what struck me the most forcibly was that from the circumstance of some wine butts having been left in the apartment and having in the engagement been perforated by bullets and otherwise broken, the red wine had escaped most plentifully and ran down upon the earthen floor where the wounded were lying, so that many of them were soaked in the wine with which their blood was mingled. I hate to even think about the medical care that these guys are getting. Yeah. And the medical care that we had in Iraq was unbelievable. Not only from the speed that you would get assistance, but also the quality of care that you would get in the field from our own medics, and how quickly they would get to you and then get you taken care of and then get you evacuated to a full medical facility. And that actually changed during my time in the teams. For instance, the biggest change, when I first got in the teams, what we were taught was if someone gets shot, you immediately give them an IV, meaning a bag of fluid, because they're bleeding. You got to replace that. And now they don't do that automatically, because your body has its own mechanisms when it loses blood to stop the bleeding. It pulls back in the arteries and veins, and it constricts them, and it clots the blood that's there. And when you give someone an IV, the body thinks, I don't need to do that. So it opens up the arteries, it opens up the veins, it doesn't constrict anything, it clots slower. So there's like one example, and that's during my time. So that's the last 25 years that change has taken place. So now you go back, 100 and 200 years, it's totally different, totally different. And they'll talk more about that. I mean, the basic plan was, if you get shot in the limb, you're losing the limb. That's basically what's going on, just amputations. And nowadays they do an incredible job of saving limbs. If they can be saved, they save them. I mean, they do an incredible job. All right, back to the book. It was on the 15th of August when we first came up with the French, and their skirmishers immediately commenced operations by raining a shower of balls upon us as we advanced, which we returned without delay. And I haven't said this yet, but the reason they're saying balls instead of round is because these guys are shooting balls, round balls of lead. And at this point, there was some rifling had started to come about, but what they basically just consider everything to be a ball of lead. And that's why they're not accurate. That's why they're only accurate out to 200 meters, because they're not rifled like we have the tight rifling spinning bullets today. Back to the book. The first man that was hit was Lieutenant Bunbury. He fell pierced through the head with a musket ball and died almost immediately. I thought I never heard such a tremendous noise as the firing made on this occasion, and the men on both sides of me, I could occasionally observe, were falling fast. I do not pretend to give a description of this or any other battle I have been present at. All I can do is tell the things which happened immediately around me, and that, I think, is as much as a private soldier can be expected to do. Soon afterwards, the firing commenced, and we had advanced pretty close upon the enemy. Taking advantage of whatever cover I could find, I threw myself behind a small bank, where I lay so secure that although the Frenchmen's bullets fell pretty thickly around, I was enabled to knock several over without being dislodged. In fact, I fired away every round I had in my pouch whilst laying in this spot. At length, after a sharp contest, we forced them to give ground and, following them up, drove them from their position in the heights and hung up their skirts until they made another stand, and then the game began again. The rifles indeed fought well this day, and we lost many men. They seemed in high spirits and delighted at having driven the enemy before them. Joseph Cochan was by my side, loading and firing very industriously about this period of the day. Thirsting with heat and action, he lifted his canteen to his mouth. "Here's to you, old boy," he said as he took a pull at its contents. As he did so, a bullet went through the canteen and perforated his brain, killing him in a moment. Another man fell close to him almost immediately, struck by a ball in the thigh. I saw a man named Simmons struck full in the face by a round shot, and he came to the ground, a headless trunk. When the roll was called after the battle, the females who missed their husbands came along the front of the line to inquire of the survivors whether they knew anything about them. So the wives could travel with the soldiers. And again, that just seems crazy to me right now, but that's the way they did it. Yeah. And not all of them, but if they made that decision, I guess, as a family to stick together, they'd get right on board the boats and they'd march. They march and they cover it in this book. They wouldn't carry the weight, but they'd march alongside and go from place to place. And when the battle's about to take place, they'd hang back. And then you have the situation once the battle's over that I'm talking about right now. Amongst other names, I heard that of Kochan called in a female voice without being replied to. The name struck me, and I observed the poor woman who had called it as she stood sobbing before us, and apparently afraid to make further inquiries about her husband. No man had answered to his name or had any given account to give of his fate. I myself had observed him fall, as related before, whilst drinking from his canteen. But as I looked at the poor sobbing creature before me, I felt unable to tell her of his death. At length, Captain Leach observed her and called out to the company, "Does any man know what has happened to Kochan? If so, let him speak out at once." Upon this order, I immediately related what I had seen and told the manner of his death. After a while, Mrs. Kochan appeared anxious to seek the spot where her husband fell, and in the hope of still finding him alive, asked me to accompany her over the field. She trusted, notwithstanding what I had told her, to find him yet alive. "Do you think you could find it?" said Captain Leach, upon being referred to. I told him I was sure I could, as I had remarked many objects whilst looking for cover during the skirmishing. "Go then," said the captain, "and show the poor woman the spot, as she seems so desirous of finding the body." I accordingly took my way over the ground we had fought upon, she following and sobbing after me. Quickly reaching the spot where her husband's body lay, pointed it out to her. She now discovered soon all her hopes were in vain. She embraced a stiffened corpse, and after rising and contemplating his disfigured face for some minutes, with hands clasped and tears streaming down her cheeks, she took a prayer book from her pocket and, kneeling down, repeated the service for the dead over the body. Poor woman. I pitied her much, but there was no remedy. Whole new dynamic right there. Mm-hmm. Continuing on, back to the book. It was on the 21st of August that we commenced fighting the Battle of Vimiro. The French came down upon us as a column, and the riflemen immediately commenced a sharp fire upon them from whatever cover they could get a shelter behind, whilst our cannon played upon them from our rear. I saw regular lanes torn through their ranks as they advanced, which were immediately closed up again as they marched steadily on. Whenever we saw a round shot thus go through the mass, we raised a shout of delight. That's a savage image right there. Ranks of men, and there's cannonballs that are cutting lanes through them. Yeah. And you're probably talking 20, 30 people killed each one, and the ranks just close in around them. Yeah. And that's what these guys are seeing as this advance takes place. They're continue through that battle. They get into a position for another battle. Going back to the book, as I looked about me whilst standing and ranked, and just before the commencement of the battle, I thought it the most imposing sight the world could produce. our lines glittering with bright arms, the stern features of the men as they stood with their eyes fixed unalterably upon the enemy, the proud colors of England floating over the heads of the different battalions, and the dark cannon on the rising ground, and all in readiness to commence the awful work of death with a noise that would deafen the whole multitude. Although the sight had a singular and terrible effect upon the feelings of a youth who, a few short months before, had been a solitary shepherd upon the downs of Dorsetshire, and had never contemplated any other sort of life than the peaceful occupation of watching the innocent sheep as they fed upon the grassy turf. Talk about a dichotomy.
Yeah.
No thought in his mind other than watching sheep eat grass.
Yeah. I would think that that'd be kind of a good little escape, from time to time to notice those types of things.
Yes, I think you're right. And I think that happens. And, there's a movie called The Thin Red Line. Mm-hmm. And that's portrayed very well. In all this chaos, he'll take cover and he'll be face to face with a flower. Yeah. Or he'll notice a bird or a bug. And that's definitely something that people notice. I mean, I notice there's the sunset, no matter where you are in the world. Yeah. And actually the sunset in the desert's a very beautiful thing. Yeah. And same with the sunrise. Mm-hmm. And so those are little things that you notice, even though you might not be in the mindset to notice them, you still notice them. Mm-hmm. Back to the book. The battle commencing immediately, we were all soon hard at work. The rifles, as usual, were pretty busy in this battle. The French in great numbers came steadily down upon us, and we pelted away upon them like a shower of leaden hail. Under any cover we could find and lay, firing one moment, jumping up and running for it the next. And when we could see before us, we observed the cannonballs making a lane through the enemy's columns as they advanced, as they were huzzahing and shouting like madmen. The battle soon became general. The smoke thickened around, and often I was obliged to stop firing and dash it aside from my face and try in vain to get a sight of what was going on, whilst groans and shouts and a noise of cannon and musketry appeared almost to shake the very ground. It seemed hell upon earth, I thought. A man named John Lowe stood before me at this moment, and he turned round during a pause in our exertions, and he addressed me. "Harris, you humbug," he said, "you've got plenty of money about you, I know, for you're always staying about and picking up what you can find on the field. But I think this will be your last field day, old boy. A good many of us will catch it, I suspect, today." "You're right, Lowe," I said. "I've got 9 guineas in my pack. And if I am shot today and you escape yourself, it's quite at your service. In the meantime, however, if you see any symptoms of my wishing to flinch in this business, I hope you will shoot me with your own hand." Low. So let's think about that. That's pretty awesome. First of all, the attitude of they're basically talking smack to each other. Yeah. Classic. "Hey, I don't think you're going to make it. I know you got a lot of money on you. And if you don't make it, what do you say? Is that mine? Yes. If I die, come and get it. I got 9 guineas in my pack. They're all yours." And then this is classic. "By the way, if you see me acting cowardly in any way, you better shoot me." Yeah. It's legit. Lowe, as well as myself, survived this battle. And after it was over, whilst we sat down with our comrades and rested, amongst other matters, talked over, Lowe told them of our conversation during the heat of the day and the money I had collected, and the rifles from that time to time had a great respect for me. It is indeed singular how a man loses or gains caste with his comrades from the behavior and how closely he is observed on the battlefield. Again, talking about reputation once again. Mm-hmm. The officers, too, are commented upon and closely observed. So everyone's watching the officers. The men are very proud of those who are brave in the field and kind and considerate to the soldiers and under them. An act of kindness done by an officer has often during battle been the cause of his life being saved. Got a little relationship going. Nay, whatever folks may say upon the matter, I know from experience that in our army, the men like best to be officered by gentlemen, men whose education has rendered them more kind in manners than your coarse officer, sprung from obscure origin, and whose style is brutal and overbearing. So, as I was reading through that, at first I kind of got a little bit taken aback because I said, "Oh, what are you trying to say? If you haven't been to college or that's what you need. You need to be from this good upbringing." Mm-hmm. But that's not. Well, that might be what he's saying at that time. Mm-hmm. But the important part is it's how you treat people. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what background you came from. You know, he says, "Men whose education has rendered them more kind in manners." And rather than someone that's from an obscure origin, mm-hmm. what I'm telling you is it doesn't matter where you're from. Mm. And he would agree with this now if he was here to talk with me.
Of course.
But it's not, he's talking about the men like to work for officers that aren't brutal and overbearing. No one likes that.
Yeah.
And you don't perform well. You want to build the relationship with your troops. The kindness done by an officer has often during the battle been the cause of his life being saved. That means guys are trying to win.
Yeah.
Back to the book, and let me bear testimony to the courage and endurance of that army under trials and hardships, such as few armies in any age, I should think, endured. I've seen officers and men hobbling forward with tears in their eyes from the misery of long miles, empty stomachs, and ragged backs, without even shoes or stockings on their bleeding feet.